This is day 7 of the April 87 7-day retreat. This morning, as I was just pondering over what to say or read for the last talk, someone handed me a book which contains transcriptions of talks given by Vimala Thakur, and it's so good that I will read from that. I hadn't read this book before and just made some selection. Actually, there were some suggested selections there already. I don't know how long it will take. We may have to leave some out. We'll see. The title of the book is Towards Total Transformation by Vimala Thakur, and the introduction says Vimala Thakur spent many years as a close associate of Vinoba Bhava in the land gift movement in India. She's a woman who was born in India, and traveled to every part of that country explaining his program. Then she met and heard Krishnamurti, and through that contact, her life was changed at its foundations. She felt she could no longer represent any organization, but must speak as an individual. In the last few years, she has been addressing groups throughout Europe and India. The present volume is a selection from talks given in California in 1968. Vimala develops an inquiry into the possibility of total transformation of the psyche. She begins by analyzing the factors which cause fragmentation of human consciousness. She examines with care and clarity the ongoing phenomenon of mind as a repetitive mechanism which negates capacity for clear perception. She explores the psychological structure of the ego in which man imprisons himself. She states that man must allow a new dimension of consciousness to be born in him before he can know the meaning of freedom. This selection is from a question period at an international, third meeting at the International Student Center, Stanford University. But it appears that there are people who haven't been at the previous talk, so she interrupts the question period and makes a synopsis, a comprehensive synopsis of what she has been talking about. She says, now, as there are many persons here who might not have attended any of the talks throughout the whole of October, let me state in the very beginning that these talks have not been meant for propagating any philosophy, advocating any ideology, or trying to convert people to any particular view of life. The speaker has come to your country for friendly verbal communication on matters which she feels gravely concerned about. To tell you how I look at the challenges that man is facing all over the world, what can be the way out, if at all there is a way out. What can you and I as individuals do to convert the darkness by which we are surrounded, convert the darkness in the little corner in which we may be living into light, and live in that light of personal discovery of truth, reality, God, of what you will. These are not talks given by a teacher or a preacher. Please believe that I have no claims to yoga or any authenticity in the spiritual matters of any sect, Occidental or Oriental. This is just an anonymous person, one of you, I would like to emphasize at this point for every audience, as this subject of individual transformation, liberty, freedom has been shrouded in mystery. All of this has been looked upon as something extraordinary, and persons who live in freedom are given a pedestal to stand upon. They are condemned to authority, and their words are taken to be authentic guidelights for others. To me, truth is simple. Freedom is simplicity and humility. Freedom is the privilege of every human being, not the privilege of a chosen few who have to follow a special way of life. This is the unusual approach of the person who has come to converse with you. Not to speak to you, but to have a verbal communication with all of you. I am aware of the limitations of words as a medium of exchange and communication. The verbal communication is ridden with so many limitations. The first limitation is the burden of association of ideas and emotions that every word carries for every person. You, as well as I, have some association of ideas, emotional responses, and intellectual responses to every word that is uttered. Also, the language I am using is a language that I am only acquainted with, but have not studied as a language. I may use terms and words in all simplicity, without their having any overtones or undertones. And yet the same words may stimulate certain associations in your minds. It is really very difficult to establish a point of contact between the speaker and the listener through words. More than that, words create gaps between the speaker and the listener rather than bridge the gap that may be existing. Every word is heavily loaded, and yet we have to use words. I'm not oblivious of this fact of the burden that every word carries. No human consciousness is free of these associations, of ideas and emotions. We have to get over those hurdles and obstacles to meet one another. We have to meet one another in spite of the words to be used, which may create distances, which may create gaps. Now we were talking about the mechanistic nature of mentation. Mentation, she uses that word for every movement of the thinking mind. Mentation is mental action, mental movement. Every mental movement is passive. Every mental movement is passive. It is repetitive and mechanistic. Let us go into this mechanistic nature for a few minutes. Unless we know the content of bondage, we cannot transcend it. Understanding the nature of bondage is really the beginning of freedom and liberty. Mental activity, like thinking, feeling, willing, reacting, indicates, does it not, that an external compulsion stimulates the response within us. I'll say it again. Mental activity like thinking, feeling, willing, reacting indicates, does it not, that an external compulsion stimulates the response within us. It can be an impression received through the senses, which stimulates the nervous system, carrying over those impressions to the brain, stimulating and tickling certain brain cells which interpret the sensations according to the education, the culture, the pattern of behavior in which one has been brought up. The brain cells are also conditioned in specific ways, and they react to the stimuli according to the conditioning. This is the first limitation of mental action. The compulsion may be through a sensual experience. The compulsion can be through memory, the past experiences. When a person is placed in a certain situation or set of surroundings, it brings the memory of past experience to life, and that memory twists and distorts the perception of the present situation and dictates the reaction. Thus, there can be a compulsion created by memory, just as a compulsion can be created by a sensual experience. A compulsion can be created inside the person by memory. Compulsion can be created by the subconscious, which is a storehouse of personal knowledge and experience, as well as the knowledge and experience of the family in which one is born, the community in which one is brought up, the religious denomination to which one belongs by birth, and so on. Subconscious is the storehouse of all that. Sometimes it's not the surface consciousness or the conscious mind which creates the compulsion to react, but something in the subconscious coming to life suddenly. An urge, a drive, a passion, which brushes aside every rational consideration and makes a person act in certain ways. And then one says to oneself, "Oh, I don't know why I did that, but I did it." I'm talking about something which goes deeper than impulses. Impulses can be on the surface consciousness also. Well, that is the layer of the subconscious. Deeper than that still is a layer of consciousness, the psyche, which has been explored by man in bygone centuries. It is the unconscious, the experiences of the whole human race, experiences from the first human being, perhaps, who inhabited the globe. The residue of collective human experience and knowledge is stored there. The visions and extrasensory experiences which cannot be analyzed by the conscious mind sometimes create compulsions, and man reacts out of them. The conscious, the subconscious, the unconscious, all these are names that we're using for verbal communication. In reality, there is only one indivisible whole consciousness. There are not watertight compartments as conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. For the sake of study or verbal communication, one can use these words tentatively. They haven't any absolute reality. As long as any compulsion is created by the outside world or by the conditioned psyche inside ourselves, it is no action at all. It is a compulsion stimulating a reaction. That is why one says that all that you think and feel is predetermined for you by society, by the collective humanity. There's nothing original, nothing creative in any mental activity whatsoever, whether it is composing verses, whether it is sculpture, art, or music. One has to fall back upon the symbols which man created centuries ago, the arbitrary relationship between those symbols and the association of ideas and emotions with these symbols are loaded function in every field of mental activity. You cannot think a thought without words. Just imagine, the mind cannot move without words. feelings, emotions, and sentiments have been defined. They have been labeled, put under certain categories, aesthetical, ethical, religious, or spiritual category. Everything has been categorized. They have been measured for us. The weight, the color, you know everything. And we have been brought up in that. Those who have been brought up in the non-religious communist countries have evolved through the last half-century a different conditioning pattern. Words have a different meaning for the people living in those parts of the world than the meaning given to them by a religious community. These symbols and their arbitrary relationships, which have been predetermined for us, determine the nature of our reception. How we receive a sensation, even that is predetermined for us. The responses are dictated by these symbols, these words. Nothing that man does through the mind is really original. Is man doomed to live in the bondage of his own knowledge and experience? The content of man's knowledge and experience is really the only objective bondage. There is no other bondage from which one has to set oneself free. People feel that for attaining freedom, for becoming liberated, living in nirvana or satori or what you will, one has to run away from the house and away from the family and go to some cave, forest, monastery, ashram or whatnot. Go where you will carry the mind with you. You will carry the content of your knowledge and experience with you. That knowledge and experience will color your perception. It will dictate the nature of your response. The mind, which is the product of the collective humanity, the mind, which is the product of the collective humanity, the product of society, will accompany you to the cave. It will be there. It seems to me that this giving up of things in the so-called objective world, this running away from the situations in which one is born, is really an unscientific and outmoded way for discovering truth. It is unwarranted in this age of science. What is warranted is something quite different. What is warranted is trying to transcend the content of psyche and finding out if there's any other dimensions to our consciousness. Any other dimension to our consciousness. Is all of our consciousness exhausted by the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious, which has been explored, mapped, and charted out for us? Is that the only consciousness for us? Is there anything beyond? That is the basic challenge. Now, as one is looking for experiences, one is on the mental plane. Whether I'm looking for an experience through the senses, or I'm looking for an extrasensory experience, or whether I'm looking for an occult experience, or I'm looking for a transcendental experience, I, as an entity, the ego, the self, the me, wants to continue and sustain himself through experiencing. The ego, the self, the me, the I consciousness is really sustained only through experiencing. The moment there are no new experiences for the I, the ego feels bored. So the ego is always hunting for experiences, if not in the material world, at least in the intellectual world. And if ideas, ideologies, and theories do not attract the mind, then it goes to the extrasensory, the occult, and transcendental world. But the ego always hunts for experiences. It lives through experiencing. Experiencing is acquiring a new sensation, acquiring a new way of adjusting that experience to the whole being, to the totality of my life. So long as I want to have an experience, it is really an ego-centered activity. I may stimulate the whole being through some biochemical action of drugs. I may pacify and soothe certain brain cells through chanting certain words. I'm trying to create an impact on the brain, or I'm trying to stimulate the brain cells to get a new variety of experience. Psychedelic experiences are experiences which people may arrive at through expanding the scope of consciousness for receiving sensations, through heightening the sensitivity, so that the intensity of experience is 100 times more than in the ordinary state of consciousness. I have not taken the drug, so I do not know. I may be wrong. But I have understood that these drugs, these chemicals, heighten the sensitivity. Generally, we live in a very dull state of our being, and we pass through experiences half-heartedly, absent-mindedly, with a distracted mind. We do not live with a deep passion to go through every experience, through every moment of life intensively. We live perhaps intensively in the rare moments of love. Otherwise, we are floating on the surface consciousness, passing through experiences without living totally any of them. So psychedelic experiences, a person had asked about that, and this is when she started the whole talk. So psychedelic experiences may be a state of heightened sensitivity. Whenever sensitivity is heightened and intensified, it has a quality of perceiving. It has a quality of intelligence. You know, intelligence is the highest sensitivity. So it widens the scope of consciousness for receiving impressions and sensations. Secondly, it heightens the sensitivity. And thirdly, you are set free for some time from the ordinary ego consciousness, so that one feels elated, intoxicated for a certain time. Maybe that is what and how it is. I would like to say that in the state of meditation, there is no scope for any experiences or any experiencing. The state of meditation is a state of consciousness in which every mental action ceases to be. The mind is completely silent. It is not moving in any direction. The ego, the self, is in complete abeyance. He's not eliminated. You cannot eliminate the past, the memory. You cannot destroy the ego. People who have tried to kill the memory, benumb the ego, paralyze the action of the ego, these people mutilate their consciousness. They do not arrive at transcendence of the psyche. The mind has all the talents and capacities intact. Everything is there, and yet the mind is not moving. There's a total cessation of mental activity. That is real meditation. What does that mean? The mind does not move. The mind does not think, feel, or react. What does that mean? Does it not mean that the energy which was running in different directions, which was divided into contradictory desires, conflicting intentions and ambitions, which was scattered in all directions, comes back to its origin. This is something which one can really experiment with. All the vital energy which was scattered in reacting emotionally or intellectually, every thought verbalized or unverbalized, every emotion manifest or unmanifest, the slightest movements of the mind causes expenditure of vital energy. Every thought, every feeling disturbs the rhythm of breathing and the rhythm of blood circulation. Every thought, noble or ignoble, every feeling, virtuous or otherwise, disturbs or gives a jerk to the whole chemistry of the body. But when mental activity, mental action ceases to be, there is perfect rhythm. There is a harmony in the rhythm of blood circulation. The digestive process, the glandular, the muscular, the nervous system, all are in harmonious state of silence. We do not know what that is. We do not know how our whole being is when there is a complete harmony between the nervous, the muscular, and the glandular systems. So the biological and psychological are in harmony as the mind is not functioning. In that cessation of mental activity, silence, not as an experience of the mind, but as a dimension of consciousness. In that cessation of mental activity, silence, not as an experience of the mind, but as a dimension of consciousness, that silence comes to life. Energy gathered unto its original source or fountainhead in all the intensity and depth starts functioning then. At present, the energy in its totality has no opportunity to function, since all the time the ego is dividing it, pulling it, pushing it, attracting it to so many directions, in so many directions. We do not know how the totality of energy can move, and what happens when it moves in its totality. That's what happens when mental action ceases to be. When there is a thought floating on the consciousness, it not only divides energy, but distracts the attention. In the state of meditation, when mind ceases to function, there's no distraction. Your attention is not focused on any particular point, so there's a state of all-inclusive attention. Wherever you may be, you're capable of perceiving the totality of a fact without any conscious effort. At present, we are not capable of perceiving the totality of any fact because the mind has chosen. The moment the eyes perceive, the likes and dislikes come up, the preferences and prejudices come up. Before the intelligence has perceived the totality of a fact, the ego has made his choice, compared the given fact with something else, arrived at a decision, and either selected it or rejected it. Thus, the experience cannot be a total experience. The perception cannot be a total perception as long as the ego moves. There's no simple observation of a total fact. We have to learn that art of simple, total observation of a whole fact. We see only the fragment of a fact. Mind is eager, craving to react, so before the totality is taken notice of, the mind has already reacted. That reaction becomes the inhibition of perception. It inhibits the perception. It inhibits the response. In both ways, you cannot move. You are carried on the momentum of the reaction of the ego. Thus, the reaction of the ego distorts the perception and inhibits the response. In the silence of the mind, in the silence of the ego, you are in an all-inclusive state. There is a simple observation of a total fact. The response does not become one-sided. The response is not inhibited by your past knowledge and memory. It is spontaneous. So the fourth point is, spontaneity of response is possible only in the silence of the mind, not before. Then you may travel in various countries, absolutely new conditions and new ways of life for you, and yet you're not in a hurry to judge them. At present, the mind comes up and says, oh, he's an American, he's a Russian, we know he's German. So before you've understood the person, your mind has judged him. The word Russian, the word German, according to the knowledge and experience, has a limited content, and that content of knowledge becomes the frontier beyond which I cannot move. So my response is not to the human being, but to a Russian, to a German, to a communist, to a Catholic, and so on. I do not really meet any human being as long as my perceptions are colored by the conditionings in which I have been brought up. That's why we are living side by side, but not together. All the countries live side by side. Space is shrinking, and time is reduced to really nothingness by the advances in science and technology. But the human mind is tethered to worn-out theories and concepts about one another's cultures and to the patterns of reactions to those cultures. So we do not meet one another. We are merely coexisting. In the international organizations, we sit around the tables, trying to protect the vested interests of our nations, whether it's the colored people or the white people. They may create compulsions on the basis of majority and try to create political and economic compulsions for the rest of the world. That's not going to solve the problem. The racial consciousness, the commitment to ideologies, the commitment to the theory of national sovereignty, we owe allegiance to all such worn-out, outmoded theories, concepts, and notions. And we're living in an age of space travel, an age of computers and electronics. What's the use of my traveling from here to Japan in 10 hours, while the mind is somewhere in the 19th century? So I really do not see anything. I do not really meet anyone. And it seems to me that man cannot have peace as long he is living with his worn-out mind, individually and collectively, living in and through the symbols which have lost relevance to the facts of life, in this devastatingly new context of life. Now the lady asks, how do you do it? How do you do it in practice? One does not practice anything. When one realizes that whatever the mind does is not really something original, that it is only a reaction and not an action, this very understanding will do something to me. If I only take it as an idea newly brought up, then I will fall back in the trap of the mind. I will bring home a new idea, store it in the memory, and try to approximate my action to it. But if one sees in one's own life the truth of this, that every mental action is mechanistic action, cerebral activity, as a fragment of human life, not the totality of it, and that there is much more to the human psyche than these hitherto explored parts, the first result will be, will it not, that one is set free of all the vanity and pride of one's thoughts and emotions, norms and standards and valuations of life. Set free of all the vanity and pride of one's thoughts and emotions, norms and standards and valuations of life. These are closer to us than our skin. This psychological structure, this defense mechanism that the ego has constructed of thoughts and emotions. It's a thick thing, closer to us than the skin. The identification with that layer will come to an end when one sees the real nature of mentation. One is no longer proud of thoughts, one does no longer brag about thoughts, standards, and norms. So there is a freedom. A kind of new energy comes up with this realization, if it is not an academic or intellectual appreciation, but a real understanding that in whichever direction the mind moves, it is a reaction. Mind cannot act without compulsion, outward or inward, so mental action is a reaction. When one sees that, then you look at your wife or your husband at the beginning of the day in humility. You don't have the vanities to say, oh, I know him. He has done this yesterday. He has done that a week before, so I know how he's going to act the day after tomorrow. You do not have the screen of your own experience before you. You do not have the image of your husband or your wife that you have created out of memory and project that image on him. Put a mask of your evaluation on his face and then look at the mask. That's what we do when we look at one another. We have images. This mind, this image-making factory, is busy the whole day long creating images of others and of ourselves. All those masks fall away without your conscious effort. They do fall away if you're interested in discovering the truth of life, the meaning of life, and in living. Not living second-hand, passively following the patterns of behavior created for you by others, but discovering the way to live first-hand, originally, creatively. So when the day begins at the dawn, when you look at your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife, you will feel that you have never met that person before. There's a freshness about the feeling. There's a freshness in the very glance. There is a humility to look at the other person and to listen to him. We don't look at each other. We don't listen to each other. Because the moment the other person opens his mouth and utters a word, we are busy with a word and the association that that word brings up. The person is brushed aside. He's out of our focus, you see. The focus is somewhere else. But when we have the humility to say, perhaps I do not understand what he says, let me find out, then relationship will have real meaning. Then relationship will have some charm, grace, and beauty. Thus, a new quality of humility is experienced by us. You know, in the state of all-inclusive attention, the very perception of a total fact awakens humility. It's not an ego-centered activity. Look how these are radically different dimensions. One is an ego-centered activity, the other is silence. Humility is the flame of that silence which has come to life. In the light of that humility, your steps move. You look to another afresh. Supposing the other person says something which is silly, which is stupid, immediately the ego will bring up anger. That's the only way. All the knowledge and experience reduced to certain chemicals stored in your brain cells is bound to bring up that emotion of anger, jealousy, or greed. It will come up. But instead of fighting against that, instead of trying to suppress or repress that, hide or cover it up, or destroy it, instead of wasting energy in any of these directions, the revolutionary person who is trying to discover a new dimension of awareness says, now I see the word that was spoken by the other person, and I see the emotion being brought up by the ego. He has seen now the totality. The fact and the reaction, the subjective and the objective are seen. So the perspective is neither objective nor subjective, exclusively, but it is a perspective in which both the subjective and the objective are blended together. It's an all-comprehensive perspective. He sees the anger, he sees the jealousy. He had not seen these things before. The moment anger comes up, I say, I'm angry, and act out of that anger. Or, I'm jealous, and act out of that jealousy. We see it, we identify with it, and we act out of it. That's the way we have been living up until now. But when you look at it, your anger exposed to the light of all-inclusive attention loses its hold on you. It gets a grip on you the moment you identify yourself with the anger and say, I'm angry. Then anger creates chemical compulsions in your body. Tenseness of the nerves, generating heat in the body, which rushes up to your head, so many things. But when you're not identifying, it cannot have its grip on the totality of your being. It cannot have any chemical action on you. If one is not in the state of meditation, it will immediately change the whole chemistry of the body temporarily. Don't you know how persons who get angry can become temporarily insane? If you take the word of an angry man to be truly representative of his nature, you will be doing injustice to that man or the woman, whoever it is, because the person loses the poise, the balance, and anyway the margin line, the boundary line between sanity and insanity in all of us is so unsteady. We can very easily move from one to the other. Under anger, one lives and moves as if under the pressure of temporary insanity. Not only emotional imbalance, it's a chemical imbalance in the whole body, and it has its aftermath. The grip of jealousy, the grip of envy, the grip of anger, these affect the chemistry of the whole body. But let us not go into that. When you're meeting people, when you're working in the office, cooking a meal at home, talking to your friends, everything that the mind brings up gets exposed to that silence, to the humility, to the all-inclusive attention, and the quality of your response changes. It gets transformed without your conscious effort to change it. That is the beauty of freedom. All the inhibitions drop away. Freedom is the nature of man. All the complications that the ego weaves around you, the network of complexities and complications drop away. Simplicity is the nature of man. All the inhibitions, the layers of complications around us wither away in meditation. So when you ask me, how does one do it? I say it needs alertness, to be on our toes all the time, to watch what the mind brings up and how we identify ourselves with it, and how every movement of ours becomes a movement out of slavery of that momentum. We don't have to create freedom. We don't have to create silence. It's there. One has only to observe. Well, one could go into such details for hours. It's not only in being related to people that it happens. When you take your meals, for example, your relationship to every morsel of food changes. You're trying to understand the relationship of that food, the quantity, the quality, to the whole being. When you're eating, you're eating. You're not gulping things down or nibbling them and thinking about something else, neither doing justice to the food or justice to the memory. But man has lost the charm and beauty of living totally every moment of his life. We pass through half-lived experiences, half-hearted movements. The challenges of life are half met and half resolved. So challenges unmet or tensions unresolved go down to the subconscious and torture you at night in the form of dreams and intimations. Every experience which is not lived totally leaves a segment which goes to the subconscious. It may either project itself into dreams, through some intimations, or if the pressure is tremendous, it will create drives and passions which are inexplicable to any rational mind. This fragmentation of attention is the real curse. Fragmentation of attention, which is caused by the ego, is the breeding ground for all misery and sorrow in life. Transcendence from psyche is the byproduct of understanding the real nature of mental action. Now there come all kinds of questions. Would you like to hear some more? Here's a questioner who says, in the beginning, you have to start with meditation completely by yourself, in complete silence, to keep the stimulus away from yourself. How long would it take before you could move out of a room alone in silence to be able to use meditation in your relationships with people and carry it a little bit further? Now I'm completely inexperienced with meditation. If somebody starts completely inexperienced with meditation, the question is, how long does it normally take to achieve this having the mind completely relaxed to get right down to the point where you're in a state of meditation? And Vimala's response, well, this is a uniquely personal question, is it not? It depends upon, first, the state of biological organism in which a person is living, the occupation or profession in which he or she is working, the climate in which one is living, the surroundings in which one is living. In this personal discovery of truth, one experiments with one's own life. It is so personal. One has to take into consideration all these facts, and then the habit pattern in which the person has been brought up. Unless you know all this, how can you say this much time will be necessary or that much time will be necessary? I could say, oh, the time factor depends upon the intensity that one has. I mean, I could give a sweeping reply like that, but it serves no purpose. It is true, and at the same time it may not serve the purpose of communication. So one has to find that out first, the biological habit pattern, the psychological habit pattern. If one has to rush through the whole day and has to go through terrible nervous tension, then one will begin with trying to relax the body first. We don't know how to relax the body. Relaxing the body also becomes an effort of the mind for many people in the beginning. But then the person will become alert and he will watch how he sits or stands, how he walks. Is the body relaxed when he walks and sits and talks? Or are the ways of sitting and standing up and walking defective? To carry the body about in such a way that it will not become rigid in any part. The muscular rigidity or the glandular rigidity created by defective ways of sitting and standing up, or defective ways of eating. Meditation as a state or as a growth is related to everything that we do, you see. Not only the quantity and quality of food that we eat, but the way we eat it, the way we walk, the way we sleep. So people will have to go into all that first and learn the art of doing everything in a relaxed way. That could be the beginning. And people have to learn the art of observation. We do not know how to observe. If we try to observe something, it becomes an introspective activity. If anger is coming up, before I can watch and understand anger, my mind says, oh, anger is bad, I must suppress it, it must be hidden. I have to fight against anger. If jealousy comes up, if a sexual urge comes up, I immediately either condemn it or identify myself with it, reject it or accept it. Observation is watching the movement of mind without accepting or rejecting, without identifying oneself with it or condemning it. This art also has to be learned. First, one may look at things in nature and find out if one can look at something in its totality. Or does the emotional or intellectual response inhibit the perception? When I look at a tree, do I look at the totality of a tree? Or am I consumed, am I absorbed by the beauty of a flower, or the beauty of the leaves and the design of the branches that have come out? Do I look at the tree in its totality, implying manifestation of energy right from the roots to the fruit? This taking everything in one sweep of attention, that also is an art that one has to learn, and one has to learn it because it has not been included in our education. I do hope that all the world over there will be entirely new systems of education, not only new orientations to education, but the very approach to education will have to go through a radical revolution, where the acquaintance with the biological and the psychological organism, the rhythm in which body and mind moves, will be incorporated in the syllabus of the students. We are teaching physics, chemistry, biology, and traveling in space, but nobody talks about the inner space and how to travel there, how to take the inward journey. Those of us who have had not the privilege of going through such education will have to educate ourselves. Somebody says, how does one exclude thought to get into a state of complete stillness of the mind? And Vimala, the mind does not get silence, the mind can never get it. By its very nature, the mind is restless. The mind cannot have it as an experience. People are trying hard, and they have tried hard to stimulate an experience of silence. You see, if I go to a cave, I sit for hours or for weeks or months, and I cut myself off from every manner of activity, and the senses are not in touch with the objective reality. The mind has no scope to move outward, and it may experience a silence. But it is a dead silence. There is no life in silence which is experienced in isolation from human relationships. Silence comes to life as a dimension only when you're living with people. Now, thoughts cannot be excluded. We were not talking about excluding the thoughts. When you watch the thoughts without identifying yourself with them, the thoughts come up. The thought comes up and wanders about for some time, finding that there's no one to reject or accept it. The mind hops over to another thought. There also it finds that there's no one to select and reject, and the mind goes on to the third. But the momentum of the thinking process lies in the act of identification. So in the beginning, when you sit down to watch, you will find that in 10 minutes, the mind has been hopping over 20 subjects, 50 subjects, and you just watch it. It is going to the subject, coming back, going to another subject, coming back. You watch it as you watch a child playing. You don't condemn. You don't try to discipline. You don't try to control. Every attempt to control the mind gives double momentum to the mind to run away from you. Every acceptance of the thought or feeling takes the thinking process deeper. The roots of this process go deeper to the totality of your being. Every act of condemnation creates an inhibition. The more you try to condemn or hate a thing, the more it takes hold of your being and comes up in another way. When you see the thoughts coming up, you will see that the momentum is exhausted by itself. Even in your daily relationships, you're not identifying with the responses. You only respond to the challenge, to the situation, and not to the compulsion of the ego. So it is working both ways. When you're alone by yourself, you watch the momentum, and when you're related, you're watching the momentum. So the subconscious exhausts its momentum when there's no one to commit himself to it. Do I make it clear? You cannot exclude thought, because then you have to divide the thinking process in two. You divide the energy. One force is running in your subconscious, and you create a parallel force in your conscious. And you go throughout your life parallel, the subconscious and the conscious. So you live a fragmented life. Most of us today are really split personalities. The split is not on the surface. It is sometimes hidden even from our own eyes. It is hidden especially from the eyes of society. But inside we are fragments of human beings. We are not whole. This curse of fragmentation is upon the human consciousness. The questioner says, I think you have already explained it, but I don't seem to have a hold on it. If one could operate without the mind, can you describe a little bit about what happens and on what level? Is it feeling or intuition or just observation? I'm sure you said it, but I'm still lost. Vimala, no, one does not operate. In the silence of mental activity, there is not one, no person to operate. The me, the I consciousness is not there. Even the word I and the whole I consciousness is a social convenience to distinguish one person from another. A name is given and a pattern of behavior is fed into that person. Now that person identifies himself or herself with a name and a pattern of behavior. The I, the ego, is really a myth. It's like a unit of time. You have a minute, an hour, a day, or a week. Weeks do not exist, nor do years exist. Minutes do not exist, nor do hours exist. It's an invention of the human mind, dividing time into seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, and years. It is the yardstick with which we're measuring eternity. And those who mistake the yardstick for eternity are again victims of this psychological time. They carry the burdens of yesterdays and the burden of tomorrows, which do not exist. Neither yesterdays nor tomorrows exist, but they carry the burden of both, the burden of dreams and the burden of memories. So time, the unit of time, is really a social convention for collective relationships. In the same way, what you call I, you, she, he, these are man-made symbols for social convenience, for collective relationships. They are not reality. So, in meditation, one does not operate. If one operates, if the I operates, it will have to operate through the psychological defense mechanism. The animal has the instinct for self-preservation, and it acts. The instinct for self-preservation carried over to the psychological structure becomes the ego, and you act through there. That's what we have been doing, individually and collectively. Now, when that whole thing is in abeyance, the totality of mind ceases to function, then freedom becomes alive. A mature human being is born, a human being worth the name. He has no hangover of the animal instincts and drives. Mind is a great mischief maker. It is better that each one arrives there and discovers for himself what is the content, rather than one person trying to describe it for others. It would be too presumptuous for me to do so. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. You may describe outer fringes of the thing, but it does damage both to the speaker and the listener. The speaker feels that he can describe it for others and tell others what is there, so the ego gets tickled. And the listener feels, here I know it is so. And that is how, out of the simple words of liberated persons, authority is created by masses of people. You have your guru and I have mine. The quality of my master's life and of your master's life is compared, adding more misery to the already existing misery. It's enough for all of us, the misery with which we're living, isn't it? One thing I've taken care of, never to describe what happens in the state of freedom. we will end here for today.